In the black, cramped lungs of a nation learning to breathe fire, men and boys disappeared every day into tunnels without sun. They went down at dawn into a world that smelled of coal dust and sweat. They came up at dusk changed, older by years, quieter by a lifetime. Families lit lamps and prayed. The machines above ground sang the triumph of progress. Beneath that music, the earth was being eaten alive. This was not an abstract cost of prosperity. It was a price paid in flesh, breath, and broken bodies. This is the story of the coalface, of what it felt like to live and die inside a Victorian mine. To understand the mine, you must first understand the era that demanded it. The engines of the age did not appear by accident. For generations, agrarian life gave way to factories, canals, and rails. Historians call that great change the Industrial Revolution. It brought an unprecedented hunger for energy. Coal became the new blood of industry. It fed steam engines that turned textile looms in city mills. It heated vast foundries and powered ships and locomotives. It helped make Britain the workshop of the world. Cities grew at hurricane speed. Manchester's mills rose like dark cliffs along polluted rivers, and the world took note. Coal seams lay where they had always lain, under pasture, fen, and village green. But now they were valuable in a way they had never been. Whole communities reoriented around shafts and pitheads. Villages that had once tended sheep learned a mine timetable. Children's laughter gave way to the clatter of colliers' boots. The steady metallic cough of tramways carried wagons of black ore. The clang of pithead bells marked the rhythm of life down, deeper, back again. Until accident or disease stole that back again from someone every season. The mine was not a single place but a layered world. At the top, the pithead, a tangle of timber, iron, rope, and pulley, was a place of heat and motion. Men and lads queued for cages that would lower them into the earth. Others waited near the tip where coal was sorted and barged away. At the surface, you could see class and commerce. The colliery owner's neat office, the clerk's ledger, the foreman's cigarette. Intermingled with them was the raw human cost gaunt faces, miners' wives balancing provisions, and children with blackened faces who followed their fathers to the shaft mouths. They watched silently as the cages rattled. Below, the world tightened. Light dropped to a weak, trembling glow. Tunnels and galleries bored along seams that might be only a few feet high. In these low, claustrophobic passages, men crouched, stooped, and crawled on hands and knees to hew pay from the ribs of the earth. The tools were simple picks, shovels, sledges, and the first creeping mechanized cutters. Those cutters would change the labor in time, but they would not remove its hardship. The air was heavy with a sharp metallic tang, the smell of coal and fired rock, and with dust that clung to clothes, faces, and mouths. Some men read the seams like a weather map, feeling shifts in the stone with a practiced tap of a hammer. Others worked by rote, eyes on the seam, thinking only of the pile of coal that would feed their family for another week. Work was measured in inches and costs. Pay was piecework. The more coal one cut, the more one earned. That system created a brutal calculus. When the seam ran thin, or its angle forced a man to work on his knees, he still had to fill the cart. Speed meant the household above survived. Speed also meant more danger below. A family's rent, a child's schooling, bread on the table, all depended on tons extracted from a few square yards of rock. The miners themselves included children in numbers unimaginable today. Boys as young as 5 or 6 worked in the early decades of the 19th century. They hauled tubs through narrow passages, lit candles, and tended ventilation doors. Employers saw them as cheap, malleable labor. Their hands grew small and skilled at handling coal. Their voices grew quiet with the solemnity of premature adulthood. The public conscience woke slowly. Reformers, pamphleteers, and outraged clergymen began to point out the cruelty of sending infants into darkness. Yet demand was relentless, and markets paid no heed. The hazards of the pit were immediate and many. Collapse was ever present. An unsupported face could fall in an instant, burying men under tons of stone. Firedamp, pockets of methane, could be ignited by a careless lamp or a spark from iron striking rock, producing explosions that flattened galleries and killed in a single, surging breath. Black damp, a suffocating, carbon dioxide-rich air, could overwhelm a man like sleep. Then there were inundations. Groundwater, once blocked by impermeable strata, could suddenly breach into tunnels after a heavy storm or the accidental piercing of an old worked seam. Where pumps existed, they were often laborious and insufficient. But the most common killers were slow and insidious. Pneumoconiosis, miner's lung, crept into workers' bodies over years. Repeated inhalation of coal, dust-scarred lungs, and stole breath. Men who had been spry at 30 were breathless at 40, coughing like men twice their age. Accidents could claim whole families. A collapse would kill a father, leaving a mother to struggle with small children. An explosion could take several fathers at once, plunging a village into immediate poverty and grief. In the broader economy, miners were both crucial and expendable. Colliery owners invested in engines and rail links to carry coal to market, but they often skimped on safety that decreased short-term profits. The relationship between owner and worker was mediated by layers of supervisions. The viewer, an inspector representing the landowner, the overman, who supervised a shift, and the deputy who knew the seam's particular quirks. These men enforced orders, checked timetables, and sometimes, with a grim practicality, counted heads after disaster. Religion and culture in mining communities developed around this precariousness. Churches, chapels, and mutual aid societies offered consolation and rudimentary insurance. The chapel was a place to pray for a man who had been gone too long. It was also where families organized digging parties to rescue the trapped, pooling shovels and hope. Hymns of endurance and stoic resignation became part of daily life. The miners' songs, brief, low, and sturdy, were less elegy than a way to steady hands and hearts before descending. The mine entered the public imagination in jolting vignettes. Newspapers and early reporters told of pit disasters that read like biblical afflictions. Entire workforces lost in minutes, men trapped for days, mothers waiting by pitheads for news that would never soften into hope. Photographers later captured the faces, flat, set, and thickened with coal, children with darkened cheeks staring into the lens with a precocious gravity. The Victorian conscience, in pockets, was moved. Investigations were launched. Charities raised funds. Legislation inched forward. One of the first legal acknowledgments of mining's social cost came grudgingly and incompletely. The government, long wary of meddling in industry, eventually passed measures to limit the worst excesses. These laws were not the product of sudden compassion alone. They were the result of public pressure, of evangelical activism, and of political calculation as industrial Britain sought to retain a reputation of moral superiority abroad. They banned the employment of the youngest children in underground work and set rudimentary safety standards. But legislation without enforcement was paper against iron. Remote pits and shadowy crevices still flouted the spirit and often the letter of the law. Out of this crucible came resistance. Men who had always relied on one another for rescue and solace now began to band together formally, not only for religion or charity, but for bargaining power. Early miners' associations emerged, informal at first, then more structured, to demand fixed pay rates, safer practices, and compensation for injuries. Strikes were rare and risky, but compelling when they occurred. A stoppage of coal meant a stoppage of mills, a pause in the engines of the nation. Owners sometimes met protest with scabs, police, and, when necessary, military force. Yet the logic was simple and brutal. Without coal, industry could not breathe. Without men, the pit could not yield coal. That interdependence would, over decades, be the seed of organized labor's eventual power. Technological change moved like a slow tide. Steam-powered pumps tunneled deeper into seams previously inaccessible. Rails and wagons moved tons more swiftly. The safety lamp, invented to reduce the risk of firedamp ignition, offered an incremental protection, but did not solve the underlying exposure to dust and collapse. Mechanization altered the skill set the mine demanded. The hewer, the man who cut the coal with brute force, saw his role change as cutting machines appeared, but the machines rarely offered a ticket out of danger. They changed the nature of the danger and sometimes made work faster, and therefore more punishing in pace. At the same time, the mine shaped communities above ground in ways that would outlast the industry itself. Rows of terraced houses, a single street of shops, a chapel, a reading room, and the pit. These were the skeleton around which lives organized. The colliery owner could be a paternal figure, providing a company store where wages were spent, a school where children were taught, and a medical dispensary that offered basic care. This paternalism could be genuine and benevolent in small measures, but it also tied families to employers in ways that made dissent costly. The company shop's prices were high. The credit system kept many in perpetual debt. And yet there were moments of fierce humanity. When the pit exploded or flooded, neighbors did not look to employers first. They went straight to the mouth of the shaft, voices raw, and began to dig with their bare hands. They formed chains to pass buckets of water and to lower ropes. They sang to keep from panicking. The sense of mutual dependence, that the man next to you could be both your rescuer and your last companion, created a culture of solidarity that would become the emotional foundation for later unionism and political organization. Pause here. We have excavated the first half of our journey into the Victorian coal mine, the scene, setting, the anatomy of the pit, the daily rituals and risks, the social responses, and the first tendrils of resistance and reform. Ahead lies the deeper story, catastrophic disasters that forced national reckonings, the legal and political battles that reshaped labor relations, the technological revolutions that made mining both more productive and more perilous, and the human stories that map grief into reform. In the next section, we will descend further into a single disaster that changed public opinion, into the lives carved by chronic illness, into the emergence of political coalitions, and into the cultural memory that still haunts the blackened valleys. We descend again. When disaster came, and it did, with a cruel, almost operatic regularity, the country could no longer pretend mines were a local misfortune. One collapse, one explosion that took scores of men at once, could stop trains, dim factory furnaces, and send a river of petitions toward the centers of power. A single night of loss at a pithead would empty pews across a county the next Sunday. Widows' letters and deputations accumulated on the desks of politicians until the problem became too loud to ignore. Parliamentary inquiries were convened, grave evidence taken, and witnesses blackened. Hollow-eyed men who had crawled from the earth, or family members who had waited by pitheads for days, were asked to tell a story in measured terms that the corridors of power could digest. Those hearings did something crucial. They translated subterranean agony into public facts, and facts into pressure for change. Parliament change arrived, not as a single thunderclap, but as a long, grinding accretion. Inspectors were appointed with the authority to enter mines, to note unsafe practices, and to require ventilation and timbering in a way that employers had not been obliged to do before. Compensation funds began to take shape, imperfect, stingy, and often delayed, but they acknowledged a simple moral fact. An industrial society owed something to the men whose bodies powered it. Over time, regulation deepened and formalized. Mines were cataloged, shafts mapped, and rules written about how close to the surface old workings could be left before they were backfilled. Scientific expertise, geology, chemistry, and later occupational medicine, was enlisted to make the invisible hazards legible. The safety lamp was refined and distributed. Mechanical ventilators were installed. Pumps grew more efficient. These were technical remedies to technical risks.
We did what we could.
But their political adoption reflected a broader social realignment. Industrial progress would henceforth be expected to carry a measure of human protection. Yet legislation and lamps did not erase grief. Pneumoconiosis continued to claim breath, a sickness that lawyers and doctors would argue about for decades before laborers won clearer recognition of occupational disease. Families moved in patterns that memorialized loss. Some pits were abandoned, mouths covered by makeshift memorials. Some villages slowly emptied as younger generations sought cleaner air in growing cities. Where that migration happened, the physical landscape changed too. Terraces fell into disrepair, chapels darkened, and the colliery itself sometimes became a ruinous reminder of a past economy. Where the industry survived, it left a thick cultural imprint, brass bands that once called men from the pit for Sunday concerts, miners' banners paraded in festivals, and a vocabulary of solidarity. My mate. The pit. That bound people even as it described an old injury. Politics shifted with these cultural shifts. The men who had crawled through galleries and learned to rely on one another translated the same habits of mutual aid into durable institutions. Friendly societies evolved into trade associations into unions. Where it had been dangerous for a single man to withdraw his labor, collective action changed the calculus. A stoppage could halt a mill. A regional strike could threaten supply to an entire industrial system. These were not comfortable victories. Employers and the state often fought union organizing with court injunctions, police force, and refusal to recognize bargaining. But the logic of dependence cut both ways, and over decades miners won wages, shorter hours, and a growing voice in politics. In polling rooms, in town halls, and eventually in Parliament itself, miners' interests were translated into votes and policy. The pit that had once been a source of invisibility for workers slowly became the seedbed of political visibility. Technology, too, transformed the trade in ambivalent ways. Mechanization raised productivity and made previously unreachable seams accessible, at a cost. Machines reduced the need for some forms of manual labor, even as they increased the scale and speed of extraction. Where an individual hewer once measured his life in blows of a pick, a machine could cut a face in hours that once took days. That speed meant more coal out of the earth, but faster removal sometimes meant more frequent collapses and more violent failures when the machinery or the supporting structures failed. New hazards emerged: runaway wagons, high-pressure steam systems, and the risk of silicosis from fine, mechanized cutting. The mine kept changing shape, and the men who worked it adapted, sometimes successfully, and sometimes at the cost of another generation's health. Through these changes, the human stories accumulated, the small, searing details that define a culture. There were miners who kept notebooks of seam readings and weather patterns, whose hands mapped faults like a cartographer maps a coastline. There were schoolmasters whose own fathers had been trapped in pits, teaching a curriculum that included arithmetic for wages and rudimentary safety lessons for boys who might be apprenticed to the pit. There were mothers who learned to sew at night to supplement wages, and grandmothers who brought herbal balms marketed as remedies for coughs and pains. Weddings were frequently delayed when a party's breadwinner had been taken by a disaster. Christenings were quieted under the pall of practical fear. The rhythms of life bent to the pit's calendar in ways that seem almost knock-on. Harvests were timed around pit shifts so that a family might juggle fieldwork and hauling coal. Festivals were scheduled when the pit lay quiet, and mourning became a public art, with black armbands, ledger entries, and community collections forming a network of both grief and care. Memory matters. In the post-industrial decades, when coal's dominance began to wane in oil, electricity and alternative fuels rose, societies struggled with how to remember the people who had been formative but expendable. Majority of ruins for some sites were bulldozed, their ruins hidden by new development. Others were preserved as museums where the smell of dust and the dimness of a reconstructed tunnel could give the visitor a physical taste of the past. In those museums, helmets and lamps sit under glass, oral histories play on loop, and curators attempt the delicate work of telling a story that neither romanticizes stoicism nor reduces subjects to anonymous victims. Memorial plaques list names, a roll call of the ordinary whose ordinary bravery made an industrial nation possible. The environmental bill of the Industrial Revolution is another ledger altogether. Extraction reshaped landscapes. Boil heaps, the great black scars on the map, created new topographies that both scarred and, in some places, became rough micro-ecosystems. Streams were fouled by runoff, air was thick with soot, fields downwind of pitheads bore darker grasses and a mineral scent for generations. Duty of Azro comporting with all, I wigafiri and enseigne. Later environmental movements would name these legacies, and in some regions, reclamation efforts planted trees on former spoil heaps, turning wounds into green ridge lines. Yet even in renewal, the marks of extraction remained visible. a cultural architecture of towns built around a resource that once promised wealth and sometimes delivered only hardship. There is also an awkward human lesson embedded in this history. Progress is seldom free. The steam and iron and coal that fueled railways and telegraphs were paid for by hours in suffocating galleries and lungs that filled with dust. That is not to say the Industrial Revolution was illegitimate. It was also a wellspring of new possibilities, material abundance, and social transformations that eventually raised living standards. But the ledger must be balanced honestly. A modern listener hearing chopped voices and the clink of coal on rail will sense both the price paid and the value extracted. That duality is precisely what keeps these stories alive across generations. So where does that leave us now? For one thing, the cultural artifacts remain. Songs, banners, unions, and chapels survived. Political arrangements shaped by miners' struggles, public pensions, workplace safety norms, and the political voice of labor are part of our contemporary inheritance. For another, the environmental and medical legacies demand attention. Long-term health effects, contaminated sites, and economic dislocation in post-mining communities are a contemporary policy challenge that link the past to the present. Finally, there is an ethical question that echoes faintly in debates over automation, gig work, and new extractive industries. What do we owe those who do the dirty, dangerous work that makes our lives possible? Histories like this are not tombstones, they are mirrors. The blackened faces in old photographs stare across time and remind us of what industrial ambition can overlook. They remind us that policy choices to regulate, to compensate, to bargain collectively have human consequences. They teach that technical fixes can help but cannot substitute for political will and social empathy. At the pit's mouth, light still catches dust motes in the memory of those rhythms. In some valleys, pithead wheels are lit up as monuments. In others, children play on reclaimed spoil heaps. Miners' brass bands still march at festivals, and the cadence of miners' hymns can still make an audience stand a little straighter. The past, when excavated carefully, does more than narrate decline and redemption. It gives us a vocabulary for assessing our contemporary choices. I'll close with one image. A miner leaving the cage at dusk, his face a mask of coal and fatigue, pausing to run his hand over the rim of a lamp. He looks up into a sky that has not yet forgiven the smoke below. He places the lamp on a mantel, kisses the cheek of a sleeping child, and goes to bed knowing he must rise before dawn. That simple repetition of duty, the daily submission and return, is the human backbone of the Industrial Revolution. It is the reason towns survived, engines ran, and history kept turning. If you listen closely to those old songs and records, and to the slow procession of memorials and museum cases, you'll hear an argument that the mine forged more than coal. It forged a social imagination about responsibility, about the relation between labor and power, and about the moral accounting. We perform as a society. We still do that accounting. Anyways, I'm Sophia, watching the past so we can understand the present. We go down into these stories not to mourn endlessly, but to learn. I'll see you in the next era.